Hi, hi everyone. Welcome to our webinar using the FY 2025 Appropriations Process to fund solutions to homelessness. Great to have you all joining us. I'm just talking a little bit slowly because I realize that some people are probably still joining and just want to give folks a chance to do that. All right, a minute is enough on this Tuesday. My name is Sonya Acosta. I am a senior policy analyst at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities. I'll be moderating today's webinar. Again, thank you all for joining us. I'm thrilled to be joined by my wonderful colleagues, Kim Johnson at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition and Steve Berg at the National Alliance to End Homelessness for today's webinar. I'll be opening things up. I'll be turning it to Kim to talk a little bit about the appropriations process and just make sure that everyone kind of has that understanding of how this is supposed to go and then how it might actually go. I will talk a little bit about 2025 in particular, what the context is, what some of the needs are, and then we'll hand it over to Steve to talk about advocacy and what you all can do. Just a few logistics things for everybody. If you have questions, please put them in at any time. You can do that through the Q&A box. We will be answering some as we go, but then we'll also have time for Q&A after Kim, Steve, and I present. So please use that to submit any questions. We will be dropping some links in the chat as well. And today's webinar is being recorded. There will be a link sent out to the recording and to the slides. So no worries. You don't need to, capture everything that we say or everything that's on the slide. You will be able to go back and listen and look as you are preparing for your advocacy. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Kim Johnson, Policy Manager at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition.
Thank you so much, Sonya, and hi, everyone. Like Sonya said, I'm Kim Johnson, Policy Manager here at NLIHC, where I also cover our appropriations work. So before we jumped into today's topic, we thought it would be a good idea to do a little bit of level setting and make sure that everybody is at least in some way familiar with how the federal appropriations process is supposed to go. The federal appropriations process is different than many state and local government funding processes. I don't know very much about them. My expertise is in the federal appropriations process, so that's what we are going to be discussing today. So what is appropriations? Appropriations is the yearly process by which Congress funds federal discretionary programs. When we talk about federal spending, we can kind of break federal spending into two very broad buckets. One, we have discretionary programs, which funding levels for which are determined each year by Congress. So for example, housing choice vouchers, homelessness assistance grants, and the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, or SNAP, are all discretionary programs whose funding is determined every year through this appropriations process. Mandatory programs, on the other hand, their spending is predetermined by a federal law or regulation. So for example, Social Security or Medicare are both mandatory spending programs. The federal government is going to spend money on those programs every year outside of the appropriations process. The federal appropriations year also lasts between October 1st and September 30th. So appropriations bills last one fiscal year, or FY, which is between October 1st and September 30th. When we talk about fiscal year 2024, which is the funding bill that we are currently operating under, we're talking about October 1st of last year to September 30th of this year. And when we talk about FY25, which is the bill that we are planning ahead for, we're talking about October 1st of this year to September 30th of 2025. Congress has to pass 12 annual discretionary spending bills. Don't worry, we're not going to be talking about all of these. Rather, our discussion today is going to be focused on the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Bill, also known as THUD or THUD. As the name implies, the Transportation, Housing, and Urban Development Bill funds the Department of Transportation, as well as the Department of Housing and Urban Development, including all of the vital affordable housing and homelessness assistance programs that fall under HUD's jurisdiction. So there's a theoretical timeline that appropriators in Congress is supposed to abide by when they're doing this appropriations process every year. In theory, the process begins in February. The president submits what's known as a budget request to Congress. Now, a budget request is essentially almost think of it as a wish list for the administration. The administration doesn't get to decide what programs are funded. All funding is allocated by Congress. So this is really kind of a messaging bill to show where the administration's priorities are. Between February and April, members of the president's administration will take to Capitol Hill to go to different congressional hearings to justify the budget request and talk about, why the numbers look the way they do. And then between April and May, the House and Senate will talk and agree to a budget resolution that sets a top line spending number for discretionary defense and domestic programs. So those are known as 302A levels. Just to back up for a second, we talked about discretionary and mandatory spending. And then when we look at discretionary spending, we're also looking at defense and domestic. And so the 302As determine those defense and domestic spending levels. And then members of Congress also decide on top line spending numbers for each of those 12 annual appropriations bills, and those are known as 302B levels. Between May and June, the House and Senate Appropriations Committees will draft, release, and revise their 12 spending bills. Often they will pass them through committee, sometimes through the full House or Senate. And then in July to September, the House and Senate have to come together to reconcile their differences between their draft spending bills and enact a final spending bill for the upcoming fiscal year, all before October 1st, when the new fiscal year begins. So that is a theory of how this process is supposed to work. In practice, I think the last time Congress abided by that timeline was, I want to say, fiscal year 93 or 94. So more often than not, we see appropriations processes get really stretched out beyond those allocated, that allocated timeline. So looking at the previous fiscal year, we got our budget request from President Biden in March of 2023. And then stuff really hit the fan in June of 2023, when, as a reminder, and as I'm sure folks on the call remember, the federal government was running against its debt ceiling, and Congress needed to raise the federal debt ceiling to prevent a default on our national debt. As a result of that, Congress passed the Fiscal Responsibility Act, which agreed to raise that debt ceiling for 2 years in exchange for 2 years of caps on federal appropriations. And so those caps have big impacts and implications for our HUD programs that my colleague Sonya is going to talk about more in just a minute. In July of 2023, we saw the House and Senate release their budget drafts under those FRA caps. And between July and September, lawmakers attempted but were unable to reconcile the differences between the House and Senate draft bills. And so as a result, we saw a long 6-month process of continuing resolutions. So a continuing resolution extends funding for federal programs for a specified period of time. CRs just hold that funding flat, which can be particularly damaging for HUD programs because we need HUD programs to increase every year along with the cost of rent in order to just maintain the number of people who are served. And so continuing resolutions in the short term aren't terrible, but in the long term can have really bad consequences for the programs that people rely on to keep a roof over their heads. So running up against that initial deadline of September 30th, Congress passed a continuing resolution until November 17th. November 17th, they passed another continuing resolution until January 19th of 2024. January 18th, recognizing they were not going to get their work done, they passed another continuing resolution until March 1st. And then recognizing they were not going to finish their work by March 1st, Congress passed one final week-long continuing resolution, kicking the can to March 8th. And then on March 8th, Congress passed and President Biden signed into law a final fiscal year 2024 spending bill for HUD programs. So just a cool 6 months later than the timeline, dictates, we got our final FY24 spending bill. And despite that long delay, we are still going to be up against the same timeline of October 1st of this year for the FY25 spending bill. So where are we now in that FY25 process? In March, the president released his FY25 budget request, which reflected those Fiscal Responsibility Act caps. Interestingly, because the FY24 process took so long, the White House by and large drafted their FY24 budget request without knowing the final drafted their FY25, budget request without knowing the final spending numbers for the previous fiscal year. And as a result, a lot of those numbers really came in at under what would be sufficient to cover the cost of program renewals. Just last week, the House Appropriators received their 302B levels, which, as a reminder, is the top line funding for those 12 annual appropriations bills. The House received a 2% increase to that 302B for THUD funding from the previous fiscal year, but it is not known how that funding is going to break down between the transportation side of the budget and the housing and urban development side of the budget, let alone how the funding will break down within HUD's programs. So a lot is still to be decided. Senate appropriators, meanwhile, are considering a side deal for additional funding above what is allowed for the FRA caps. In the previous year, Vice Chair Collins maintained that wanted an increase for defense spending, and Chair Murray insisted any increase for defense spending be paired with an increase for domestic spending. And so we saw a significant increase to FY24 spending above what was allowed in the caps, thanks in large part to that agreement. However, despite the work that's going on now, there is little appetite to finish these bills before the elections hit in November. And so where that leaves us is that we should expect our draft bills from the House and Senate likely before the July 4th recess, but no final bills before the November elections. All of that is also to say this is really a time that we need to be weighing in with our members of Congress to make sure they know the importance of increased funding for HUD's affordable housing and homelessness assistance programs. And so the mission ahead is going to be a lot of conversations and planting seeds to ensure that when the time comes for that final FY25 bill to be enacted, we have sufficient funding for all of the programs that we care about. And with that, I will pass it right back on over to Sonya.
Thanks so much, Kim. That was a super helpful overview of the process and kind of where things are at right now. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of that context that Kim discussed, including some charts that a colleague of mine put together. And then I'll talk about some of the specific funding levels that the Biden administration proposed and that we are advocating for. So if we can go to the next slide. As Kim mentioned, we are under some tight spending caps for 2025, and that's because of the debt ceiling negotiations that happened last year, which resulted in the Fiscal Responsibility Act that set caps for 2024 and 2025. Under that agreement, for fiscal year 2025, there's supposed to be a 1% increase over 2024 levels, which is already very, very little. But this cap, getting to that 1%, includes some adjustments that are kind of not super that were a little like they were called the side deals, but these adjustments are incredibly important, and if they're not honored, then we won't even get to that 1%, which, as I think is pretty clear, is not going to be sufficient for all of the non-defense discretionary funding anyway. And unfortunately, Republican House leadership has stated that they don't plan to honor these agreed upon adjustments. So it's going to make things really difficult. As Kim mentioned, the 302B levels, those subcommittee allocations came out last week. And overall for non-defense discretionary funding, it was a cut by about 6%. So for transportation HUD, it's not quite as bad, which is really great. Although again, as Kim said, we don't really know how that's going to shake out, both between the transportation side, the HUD side, within programs, thinking about offsetting receipts. All of these kind of unknowns are still very much up in the air, but just want to emphasize that those adjustments are really critical. So if we can go to the next slide. Here's a chart that kind of shows how these adjustments help they help both sides tell their story. People can say, yep, we cut funding, but we can also say we are getting funding where it needs to be. So they were really critical. That kind of lighter blue part in the chart, those are all of the adjustments that happened for 2024. And you can see that was really, really helpful in making sure that funding got to about the same level as 2023. And from this chart, you can also see that these sorts of adjustments are not that rare. They were also used in 2023. There were kind of additional supplemental pieces to the appropriations bill that helped plus up certain accounts that really needed increased funding, including some of the rental assistance programs. So these aren't kind of abnormal things outside of the normal process for Congress. So again, it's really important that Congress can honor these agreements that were made as part of the debt ceiling negotiations. If you can go to the next slide. These funding caps and potential cuts to programs, they not only ignore the rising costs from rent or other inflation related things, but they also come on top of prior austerity. So between 2010 and 2024, non-defense appropriations, excluding veterans medical care, fell by 14% when you adjust for inflation and population growth. So we are really not spending what is needed to meet the need, not just for housing and homelessness programs, but across the board. And obviously, all of those things are going to impact people's lives in really meaningful ways. So we can go to the next slide. Digging in a bit more into the specifics of the HUD budget. So here's a chart that shows the final FY 2024 funding levels for a variety of programs, and then it shows the amount requested in the president's budget for 2025, and then the difference between those two amounts. And looking at the president's budget, as Kim said, it really reflects the restrictions of these budget caps. And it's helpful to remember also that the administration had to put together this budget before they had seen final FY 2024 numbers, because I believe the budget came out just like a few days after the final 2024 numbers were released. So some of the proposals in the budget are increases to programs, but they're pretty small. As you can see, for homeless assistance grants, it was proposed what would end up being only about $9 million more, which is just not going to be sufficient to maintain programs and, of course, to meet the need on the ground. That's similar for housing choice vouchers. And you can also see that there were some cuts or flat funding for things. So public housing, the administration actually proposed a number that ended up being lower than what was in the final fiscal year 2024 number. And public housing is a critical source of affordable housing in communities, and has already been disinvested in for a long time and really needs some additional capital dollars to preserve and restore public housing. The amount for home is flat compared to 2024, but if you look at previous years, it's a decrease from, say, fiscal year 2023. And that's true of a few different programs. While it might be an increase compared to 2024, it might be flat compared to 2024, it's a decrease compared to what the administration has proposed previously or what Congress has passed previously. So this is just, a few of the rental assistance programs, of course, the homeless assistance grants, and then some other programs that I thought might be of interest for folks. But if we can go to the next slide, this slide is really lifting up some of the asks that are included in a fact sheet that we've put together for you all to help with your advocacy. And so the first is to make sure that housing choice vouchers are fully funded, and that all existing vouchers are renewed. And so as Kim briefly mentioned, costs for the voucher program and other rental assistance programs increase every year because it's tied to rental costs. And so any flat funding or a decrease in funding will be very difficult. And the program has had some important increases lately for funding to help it catch up to the rental market. And that has been really helpful in helping housing agencies and communities connect people with vouchers. And we want to make sure that we're not going to end up losing any vouchers by insufficiently funding them. Because as it is, only 1 in 4 people actually receive the rental assistance they need. We are also recommending $4.75 billion for homeless assistance grants. And so that's a pretty significant increase over what the Biden administration proposed. And similarly, I meant to mention with housing choice vouchers, we do believe that what the administration proposed in their budget is not going to be quite enough to meet that need. What that number is will change kind of throughout the year as more data is available, but from initial estimates, it's what the administration proposes is likely going to be insufficient. So this language of fully renewing existing vouchers is kind of a helpful way to avoid worrying too much about a specific number. But if you do have questions about that, any of us can help answer. Also, looking for fully funding other rental assistance programs like public housing and making sure that there's sufficient funding for meeting those capital needs that have been unmet and can lead to unsafe living conditions for people living there. Additionally, $100 million for the eviction protection grant program, which is obviously going to be really helpful in preventing people from losing their homes and kind of trying to stem the inflow into homelessness. And then increases for the Native American housing programs, which are really important because tribes and tribal governments don't receive funding through some of these other programs. And so this kind of flexible pot of funding is really helpful for tribes to make sure that they are meeting the needs for people living on tribal lands. So that is kind of an overview of funding requests from the administration versus kind of what we think is going to be necessary, and within the context, of course, of some tight budget caps. And it is also an election year, so there's a lot going on, and the advocacy piece is going to be really key in making sure that these programs receive the funding that they need. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Steve Berg, Chief Policy Officer at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, to get into that piece.
Great, okay, thanks Sonia, and hi everybody, thanks for logging on today. So I'm going to talk for a few minutes about how people can have an impact on this whole process. We all the groups on this call do a lot of work trying to convince Congress to make the kinds of allocations that we're talking about here to get better funding for these programs. And we very much rely on people all over the country doing that same kind of work to make things happen, to have an impact. And so let me talk for a few minutes about some ways to do that. Next slide, please. Okay, there's three main points. And the first one is to have a general message that's going to appeal to a broad range of people based on shared values. And I think when we're talking about homelessness, what we've worked out over the year is really simple. It's like homelessness is bad for entire communities. I mean, it's interesting that this year we've had a lot of publicity around homelessness, more unsheltered homelessness. And we've had lots of people recognizing that it's bad for communities, although not all those people are necessarily recommending actual solutions. Sometimes they're recommending some bad stuff. So it's absolutely true that if we work at it, we can get across this idea that homelessness is bad for the entire community. And then the other important thing is that we have solutions too. What we're doing about homelessness is good for everyone. It's good for the people who are moving from the streets into housing. It's good for communities that don't have as many people who are homeless anymore and have housed people. So that's sort of the general message. Next slide, please. The second point is, besides that sort of general values-based message that anybody can be part of, the second thing you need is really timely proposals that are very much in tune with what's going on in a number of areas, specifics about what kind of increases you want to see. And Sonya ran down the list of increases that our groups are advocating for, and these are shared by a number of other national groups. They involve more housing vouchers, more investment in building housing, because we're seeing more communities that are having a hard time finding places for people with vouchers to live, and then more funding for the key homeless programs. The homeless assistance grants is what the appropriators call the continuum of care and the emergency solutions grants programs. These requests, we believe, are practical, even though we're hearing a lot about, and you saw the numbers on how tight the budget situation Congress is dealing with are. We feel like these proposals, given the strong public concern about homelessness and the clear fact that these are the solutions to that problem, we all believe that making an aggressive ask like this is got a good chance of success. Next slide, please. Okay, so there's a lot of words here, but I'll go through quickly what it is. Some important pieces of that of having a specific proposal is being able to articulate what the precise impact this will have locally at both avoiding harm to the community by having more people lose their housing, and in fact doing good in the community by getting people out of homelessness into housing in ways that improve the community in a number of ways. There are some specific items that we have asked for around funding for the homeless services workforce and for other workforces. We found that even after the worst of the COVID problems went away, many programs at the local level, we're having a hard time hiring staff, keeping staff. This is true in the homeless services programs, it's true in housing authorities, and in other local programs. So the national organizations that work on this have focused some on making sure there's specific money for workforce improvements. Next slide, please. And then more on what it takes to sell this ask. One of the important things to articulate to people is how a lot of the increases in homelessness nationally and in many communities is that people coming into homelessness, the inflow into the system is an important concept to get across to people. Mainly people who are becoming homeless for the first time, but it can be people who were homeless, were rehoused, and then have lost their housing again. But it's important to point out that the programs are doing a good job, but they're just not, Congress just hasn't put the money on the table. And as Sonya said, you know, the Housing Choice Voucher Program is funded to serve about a quarter of the people who need help. And that's been the case for decades, really. So it's no wonder that if homelessness is largely a housing problem, if that's your main housing solution, it's not going to really do the job. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, the third main point, besides having a general values-based message and also a specific ask that you can sell, is that there are a range of different activities that people around the country can do to really get this message across to Congress. The first is just participate in events like Hill Days that all of our groups run and put in place. The second is build local coalitions of advocates. It's important to have a lot of people from your local community together on some of these solutions, including people with lived experience. I mean, there's been, over the last couple of years, there's been a new and much needed emphasis on getting people with lived experience of homelessness involved in policymaking and advocacy. But this is something we've been doing for a long time. And I can tell you, I've been in many meetings where, you know, the member of Congress or the Hill staffer will look at me as this sort of the professional lobbyist and like, what do you really know? But then a person who's actually from their community and has experienced homelessness in their community talks about what it was like for them, and that just changes the whole conversation. It's very powerful and very, very important. Building relationships with members' offices is important. It's important to get other people from the community, maybe not necessarily the other homeless providers, but people like the mayor, people like members of the city council, people on your side in this sense of understanding that homelessness is a problem and what the solutions are. And get the people in the members' offices, both the key staffers and the members themselves, build relationships with them by working directly with them, by visiting them in their offices. Next slide, please. Virtual meetings with congressional staff. It's interesting that because of COVID, I think a lot of congressional offices became much more used to having virtual meetings, which is really helpful if you're in a community that's a long way from Washington, D.C. You can really use those virtual meetings, which is something that your congressional staffers are very familiar with and very comfortable with, to make those contacts and build personal relationships. And it's also important when members come back home. You know, members of Congress, they have lots of recesses during the year so they can come back and meet with their constituents. All the members have local offices where there are staff people whose job it is to get to know people like you and find out what your concerns are. We've had people invite members of Congress to come to visits, to meet with groups of people who are homeless, to see some of the programs that are getting funded. These are very important ways to make contact with people. We at National Alliance to End Homelessness, and also I know the Center on Budget and Low-Income Housing Coalition are very willing to provide all kinds of help to people who are trying to do any of these activities, to set them up and to make them impactful. So please feel free to call on us, and remember that it's a year-round job. You know, we have a Hill Day, and when people come to DC for the Capitol Hill Day, we always tell them, you know, glad you're here, but you're starting on a full-time job. But it pays off. The results are really worth it. So let me now turn back to Sonya, who's going to facilitate a question and answer.
Great. Thank you so much, Steve, for that. If you wouldn't mind staying on camera, and Kim, if you are able to come back on camera. Wonderful. Thank you both for all of that information. We have some questions. So I'm going to go ahead and get started with that. The first one is about how governments, like local or state governments, can engage in the federal appropriations process or work with advocacy groups in their efforts to impact federal appropriations process. So Steve or Kim, either of you want to start off with any insight on that?
Well, I can start. I mean, one is, you know, understand that your local government offices, the mayor of your town almost certainly has a pre-existing relationship with your members of Congress. They have lobbyists who work for them. So one thing is to sort of get to know the people that do the federal policy work for them, and find out where homelessness is on their agenda, and talk to them more about some of these ideas we're sharing here, and see if you can get them to agree to help work with them. I think the business leaders the same way. I mean, the local business leaders are very important. They all have relationships with their members of Congress, that the members of Congress usually value very highly. So one big piece of it is working with allies like that.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, I would add to just, you know, I think local governments or local agencies can be helpful in thinking about providing data or stories about the importance of these programs, about kind of the need within the community and what it looks like and who it impacts. So thinking about ways that you, if someone works for a local government or has that connection, creating that partnership to help build the case for these really important programs and increasing accessibility and affordability of housing.
I think the only thing I would add to those points too is using those connections once you discover them to also elevate the voices of people, tenants, people who have experienced or are experiencing homelessness in your communities, to really elevate their experiences and stories and let lawmakers know of the, you know, the real lived impact of some of the decisions that they're making for good and for worse.
Awesome. Okay, so another question we got is around the need for clear definitions of affordable housing. This person's community has affordable housing, but that excludes a large part of the population who needs it. And definitely that is absolutely true. I think for our groups, when we talk about affordable housing, we are really talking about housing that is affordable to people with the lowest incomes. When other people talk about affordable housing, they might mean affordable housing to people kind of around 80% of the area median income, 50% of the area median income. So even programs like the low-income housing tax credit, without additional subsidy, isn't going to help people kind of at with the lowest incomes who really need the most help. And that's where programs like housing choice vouchers can really play an important role in continuing to decrease the gap between people's income and what the rent is and what the rent needs to be to kind of maintain these properties. But yeah, Kim, Steve, anything to add around kind of this definition of affordable?
Yeah, that's such an important point, and thank you to whoever raised it too. I think too often when people hear, oh, affordable housing is going up in our community, their next thought is affordable to who, right? Because that's really the question when we talk about affordability, right? Is who is this affordable to? And to your point, Sonia, even, federal programs like the low-income housing tax credit, which is the primary way in which affordable housing is built in this country, often without additional subsidies, are not meeting the needs of people with the lowest incomes. And as a result of that, we see a massive shortage in affordable and available housing for people who are earning 30% or less of the area median income or living below the poverty line. And I think one of the other consequences too of that drastic shortage of housing for people with the lowest incomes is that puts pressure on the rental market all across the board, right? Because there's no housing affordable to, millions of people at the lowest end of the income spectrum. They're living in housing that they can't afford, and people who would otherwise maybe be able to afford, housing at 80% of AMI are suddenly having to look for housing that's even more expensive for them. And so once we begin to correct that market failure at the extremely low income side, we'll start seeing rents come down across the board. But until we do that, I don't know that we'll ever really address the root causes of the affordable housing crisis, absent that investment, that federal investment in deeply affordable housing. And like you said, Sonia, housing vouchers, which are very helpful in helping households afford rent right now.
Yeah, I would just add, I mean, we're in a period now that happens like every once in a while where housing becomes a problem for a lot of different people. It's like I just saw something online about people in a rich city and somewhere that the lowest price for a new home is $2 million, and how are people who are just starting that, and it's like that so they're worried about affordability, but it's a whole different idea of affordability than somebody who's actually homeless. But the fact is, I mean, the elected officials who are making these decisions about what to spend federal money on are hearing from those people, and I think it's important to try and figure out like who in your community is concerned about that, and can you talk to them in a way where you can come together to the members of Congress and say, well, we're worried about that, and we're also worried about people living in the streets or living in shelters for a long time because there aren't affordable rents. It's about trying to find allies on this issue, and it's it's also about, like I said, you have a broad general idea, a general theme of your advocacy, which is that housing is important to everyone. But then you also have to pay attention to fine details around this question. Well, what are we actually advocating? Is part of what we're advocating for, part of what the mayor is advocating for, part of what the Chamber of Commerce is advocating for, does that include housing in the kinds of programs that are actually going to be serving people who are at real risk of homelessness?
Yeah, thank you both. And I think a lot of kind of what you said is actually applicable for the next question I was going to raise, which is about someone shared that they have trouble sometimes developing good talking points that speak to how ending homelessness benefits everybody, as it's not just about helping those people, it really benefits our entire community. So any like additional thoughts to share on that about how ending and addressing homelessness benefits us all? I heard too, thinking about talking points like really coming from those shared values. I think that's a really important piece. But yeah, want to open it up to you both to either kind of lift up anything that you've already said in this context or add to it.
Yeah, I think so. So some of it is like real practical nuts and bolts stuff. I mean, the homelessness costs communities a lot of money. Taxpayers have to pay for that. The presence of encampments in a lot of communities, I think, has got a lot of people, like a lot of the public, sort of up in arms about that, and it's touchy because a lot of the people are up in arms about that. They're mad because people are living on the street. Well, I'm mad because people are living on the street too. But they, some of the ideas they have for what they should do about it is like the old policing solutions, whereas the real solution is a housing solution. So there's, I think part of it is just being willing to take a deep breath and really try to educate some people about what really has worked around the country during periods where homelessness was going down and was from these sort of housing first kind of approaches, and that's really a more compassionate thing, and it's also a more productive thing.
Thanks, Steve. Kim, anything you'd like to add on this?
Yeah, so just in addition to what Steve was saying, I think so NLIHC has our Opportunity Starts at Home campaign, which really brings together multi-sector partners to talk about how housing impacts people across a lot of different priorities, right? Housing is so fundamental to education, to health, to economic mobility, to all of these broader priorities. And so one thing that we've found helpful in our advocacy, and one of the goals of the Opportunity Starts at Home campaign, is really bringing in those multi-sector partners to emphasize the cross-sector impact of affordable housing investments. Affordable housing benefits everyone. When communities are strong, when people have a safe place to call home, everybody thrives more, everybody has a better chance at thriving. And so in addition to, leaning on, the information that Steve and Sonya shared, just turning to unlikely collaborators or unlikely, colleagues and partners in this work to help make your case.
Yeah, that's a great point, Kim, that, collaboration is going to be key, and finding kind of those, again, like shared values or kind of intersecting issues is going to be really helpful. Okay, we have a lot of great questions, and so we will likely not have time to get to all of them. So apologies in advance if we're not able to address yours, but the next one I want to get to is, where do you see the greatest need for homelessness researchers to advocate for policy changes, and how are we needed? So any thoughts on kind of how folks researching homelessness can plug in and be helpful in advocacy around appropriations or more broadly?
Well, we have at the National Alliance to End Homelessness, we have a research council. This is a group of national researchers who have worked on homelessness for many years, and they have a whole research agenda. So you should get on our website or email me afterwards and put you in touch with some of those people. I think that some of the things are, it's like I said, the two main points are like homelessness is bad and what we're doing is good. So research that supports those two things, I think is the most important thing. I think that the fact that certain people have sort of decided that they use housing first as a dirty word to try to get political benefits, which is something that's happening that we're not talking about too much, but I don't think it's a very effective strategy by those people, but whatever, they're still doing it. So I think it's important to have research that backs up the fact that what is effective at getting people out of homelessness, what is effective at preventing people from becoming homeless, and then making sure that the programs that the federal government is running is funding those things, I think is an important thing.
One thing that comes to mind for me as well is, relatedly, research on kind of best practices and what communities are doing to address homelessness broadly, but, also for specific groups who might be experiencing an influx of folks experiencing homelessness. So, for example, older adults are experiencing homelessness at greater rates than previously, but really just figuring out kind of best practices and how we can spread those best practices to other communities to make sure that folks know how to address the needs of people around the country.
Yeah, thank you both. Those are all great points. I think just a few things to add around research and kind of plugging into advocacy efforts. I think making sure that whatever research you're doing, you can put out in an accessible way so that it's easy for advocates to use and can pull from for their efforts. I think also just researchers continuing to think about qualitative research and really kind of talking to people and getting a sense of their experience with different systems. To a point that Kim made earlier, people with lived experience are not always included in these conversations and decision-making processes. So the more that we can do that, the better. And qualitative research can be kind of one piece of those sorts of efforts. I'm seeing a few questions around payment standards for housing choice vouchers. So I'll say a little bit about that. So, the past few years, we've really seen rents increase substantially, and there have been increases to the voucher program to try to help the program catch up. And so HUD is kind of, because the 2024 appropriations process ended fairly late, right? It was just in March. HUD and housing agencies are kind of just now getting their allocations of funding so that they can figure out what payment standards they can set under their funding levels. And of course, that is up to the housing agency, and that is another place where advocacy can be really important, and trying to build relationships with public housing agencies who administer rental assistance programs to see, like, are you doing everything that you can to make sure that these vouchers can be well utilized in our community? And that includes maybe having higher payment standards, which is another reason why making sure that there is sufficient funding in 2025 is so critical, because if there's not, housing agencies are not going to be able to increase payment standards to actually reflect the rental market, making it much more difficult for households to use the vouchers, and will also limit the options of where they can rent. And housing choice vouchers, like, part of the idea of this program is really about choice and letting people and expanding opportunities for households. So I think there is some room for advocacy locally. And certainly there's advocacy at the national level too, that our groups do work on to try to make sure that HUD is doing what it can to make sure that housing agencies are utilizing all of the tools available to them. I don't know if Steve or Kim, you want to speak at all about payment standards. All right, I figured that one I could just go ahead and take. Let's see if there is one more question before we wrap up. A lot of great comments. Sorry, I'm scrolling through. There's a lot of great comments in here. Okay. How do you see states and communities maximize federal appropriations and make the case for increasing investments and solutions to homelessness, especially in terms of newer strategies and approaches like leveraging health-related social needs funding from Medicaid dollars through CMS?
Yeah, I'm glad that came up, because we've been talking for a long time about Medicaid and how important that is to dealing with homelessness. I mean, certainly not everybody that's homeless has some big medical problems, but many do. Especially now, as the fastest growing group of people homeless are older adults. Just the healthcare needs are very important, and it's like the people in the housing world will say, well, we have housing. And I never used to hear this. For the last couple of years, I've heard more of this. We can find housing for people, but we need help with taking care of them once they're in the house. Medicaid is the program that's set up in the United States for healthcare for low-income people. It's an entitlement program. It's funded with the idea that everybody who's eligible will get help, unlike our poor little housing programs. So the problem isn't so much money as it is organizing programs, working with the Medicaid agencies, working with the hospitals to use this, relatively complex system to provide the health care that people need, behavioral health care, substance abuse treatment. Housing will pay for a lot of sort of housing-related services that a lot of times we're paying with continuum of care money that's very hard to get, and it would be much easier to afford with Medicaid. So I think we have all of our organizations have worked with states who are doing a good job of this with their Medicaid programs, and I think there's lots of room to do more.
Yeah, thanks for that, Steve. Go ahead, Kim.
I was just going to add too, I think that's a really great question. And one thing that I've been very impressed by is the flexibility and imagination of advocates who are looking at these various funding streams and figuring out how to weave them together to basically make up for the gaps in funding that the federal government is failing to provide. And so I really appreciate the idea of working, with CMS and other health-based groups to really bring in that additional funding around housing and supportive services. Also, I handle NLIHC's portfolio related to reentry housing and removing barriers to housing access for formerly incarcerated and convicted people. And one idea that we've been floating out there too is, stronger partnerships or funding through the Department of Corrections or Bureau of Prisons in order to use some of that funding to address the housing needs of people exiting incarceration. And so I think it's a really important point. And one of the other things too, just related to a point we discussed earlier around best practices, you know, sharing, being able to collect best practices and research around kind of weaving these funding streams together and promulgate that would be a really, really significant step in helping advocates figure out how to put those pieces together.
Absolutely. Well, that's a great note to end on. And I think it highlights some of the comments and questions that we were also seeing in the chat around like what we discussed here today isn't going to solve everything. There are many kind of solutions, aspects, pieces of this and ways to plug in and get involved. Obviously, we were just focusing on federal appropriations today, and even this process has its limitations, as I think we've kind of made clear, but it's so critical and so vital. And so we appreciate you all joining us today to learn more. And we hope that this has been helpful for you as you prepare to engage in this process, however makes sense for you. And we are here to be a resource. And again, you will be getting a link to the recording and a copy of the slides, as well as some additional resources that we've shared in the chat. So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, Steve and Kim, for joining me. Thank you for the team at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition for doing a lot of the legwork in the background, especially Elena Calabro, who kind of herded us cats and made sure that we knew what we were supposed to be doing. So shout out to Elena, and thank you, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.